And it's my pleasure to introduce you to Nancy Condee, who is a professor of Slavic and Film Studies at the University of Pittsburgh and director of the Center for Russian and East European Studies, one of 12 federal centers funded by the US Department of Education. She's also a co-organizer of the Pittsburgh Film Symposium held each year in May at the University of Pittsburgh. Nancy Condee wrote several monographs and books, regarding our conference, especially interesting for us is the Imperial Trace, Recent Russian Cinema, which includes a chapter on Kira Muratova titled Zoological Imperium. She will probably talk more about that. And this book won the Kovac Book Award from the Society for Cinema and Media Studies. But her recent publication include also the Cinema of Alexander Sokurov, which she edited together with Birgit Boimers. Then cinemas, the most recent book is Cinema Zores, Russian Film in Contemporary Context, 2020. Other volumes include Antinomies of Art and Culture, Modernity, Postmodernity, Contemporaneity, edited with Terry Smith and Okui and Visor, and Soviet hieroglyphics. Her articles have appeared in The Nation, The Washington Post, October New Left Review, Sight and Sound, as well as in Russian journals like Новое литературное обозрение, Сеанс, Знамя, Вопросы литературы, искусства, кино. She has also worked as a consultant for the Edinburgh Film Festival, the Library of Congress, and public broadcasting. And her research interests include contemporary Russian cinema, of course, empire theory, contemporary culture, and late Soviet culture. And today, Nancy will present her keynote titled Philistines and Janitors, Dissembling in Muratova's late 20th century. Nancy, we are really happy to have you today. Even though it's only online, we would like to meet you here in person, but it's given the situation, it's really difficult. We understand that. We will we will have a questions and answer session after your talk, so we can both ask you from the Zoom and from here, from the conference room. You're welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Caroline. And thank you to everybody who organized this under the most daunting of circumstances. Am I talking loud enough for you? Can I get a thumbs up from the listeners or a wave? Yeah, okay, good. Many thanks for inviting me. I'm so happy to be included in this. And what I missed in the previous talks, of the ones that I missed, I'm really looking forward to reading them. And I hope that you push through. Many of us have talks that we gave and then didn't actually finish writing up and publishing. Write it up and publish it. You will have a reader in me, and I look forward to all of us pushing through and seeing our work in print. My talk is in 3 parts, a very short first part by way of introduction, and then 2 longer parts. I'm watching the timer so I don't go on too long. I welcome questions and answers, but more than that, I welcome discussion. In other words, it's quite fine with me to hear repliki, utterances in response that don't necessarily have a question at the end of them. I often find they're the most useful form of interaction, even though it's not a dialogue in the strict sense of the word. So Philistines and Janitors. Introduction. This talk opens up a new direction in my research. It does not intend to be raggedy, but it will be. New ideas remain unvarnished for a very long time. And my goal at this stage is less to persuade you that I'm correct than to open up a field of discussion for which the filmmaker Kira Muratova is, in my view, a participant figure. As for the title of this talk, to those of you who recall some of the metropolitan life in late Soviet intelligentsia, the juxtaposition of Philistines and Janitors may evoke the period from at least the mid-1970s onward, when it was possible, at least for some, to lead a relatively stable and interesting cultural life, however impoverished. The metropolitan Prapiska allowed some of the more gifted people a place to sleep, almost enough to drink, artist friends, and very little regulated work. And those of us who were lucky enough to live there at the time, to enjoy their company, learned all kinds of bad habits. including the art of dissembling. And I honor them here in this talk, the Philistines and the Janitors, who are also poets, graphic designers, scriptwriters, actors. They constitute a kind of late Soviet lifestyle that I will describe here as an aspect, and only one aspect, of Second World modernity, to which I will return later. So that's in a brief glimpse at what the title signals. You'll find much in the argument at first that pertains to Muratova's work only gradually, because I'm setting up a playing field, as perhaps is appropriate to a keynote that brings you the big picture, but because it's the big picture, it necessarily therefore leaves a good deal unelaborated. The talk is as much about context as it is about text. So that's the first section. The second section, which is larger, is called Reflexivity. If we choose for a moment to look at Kira Muratova not only as an exquisite art house director, with all the necessary insularity and close reading required of us so as to contribute to that project, we also instead look at this key figure as she's located in what I'm choosing to call the landscape of Second World modernity. And we see in her work, in its broadest outlines, a key marker in the struggle to engage in self-observing reflexivity. Paradoxically, in Muratova's case, this outsider's view is gained in part by a project of an intense interiority. As she says in an interview with Jean-Michel Frodon, egoism is the essence of my métier. The achievement of the egoism of sheer interiority sequesters the filmmaker from her context, not because the Second World modernity was inferior or unique or destructive or distinctive, though it may be any of those things, but only because it is the given reality system. Here in Muratova's work, minute artistic decisions, sometimes ironic, sometimes cruel or empathic, sometimes playful, always playful, one might assert, are in dialogue with an official ideological field that devalues self-reflexivity as superfluous, ornamental, merely decorative, insufficiently teleological, and certainly derivative. That ideological field may indeed be correct in its verdict. Self-reflexivity, which we sometimes call consciousness, may indeed be trivial, unnecessary, and even detrimental. As any film jury will tell you, opinions vary, and they vary as positions of power they occupy. Muratova's reflexivity in her cinema may play itself out in a number of ways that have been exhaustively explored elsewhere, including in my own work. In minuscule ways, in her doublings and repetitions, in her twins and multiple auditions, in her mass komsomol weddings and repetitive gestures, in speech rehearsals. These are the micro elements, the artistic decisions for which we have come to treasure her work. I want to take a brief intermezzo about this tendency towards repetition without rehearsing more examples of it, to say the following about formalism. As we move forward, I want to comment on an intriguing aspect of Muratova's repetitions. We were taught back in 1917 by Viktor Schulzki that everyday life's repeated words, gestures, and images exist in a state of automatization, expressed in life's practical language. This repetitive state, as Schulzki teaches us, might be overcome artistically by defamiliarization, encountered in the literary text as its poetic language. For Schulzki, it is defamiliarization, or making new, that amplifies artistic perceptibility, making the stone stony. Defamiliarization forces the reader to recognize poetic language. It is made new by being difficult. For Muratova, by contrast, automatization, often through repetitive cliches, is defamiliarization. In a spirit compatible with her Moscow conceptualist confrères, let's say Eric Bulatov on the one hand, Dmitry Prigov on the other, she embraces repetition, ritual, and ceremony so as to amplify their perceptibility. Hyper-repetition induces a welcome alienation. And so an inversion obtains to function as though by formula, as Schulzki puts it, and for him, this remains a sure marker of practical language, is now for Muratova and others the stuff of poetic language. And perhaps it is not coincidental that Schulzki's reasoning, now less universal than it had first seemed, occurred in 1917. That is to say, just before the great Soviet project of automatization began to take full force in artistic production. We must not be distracted by this idea, but you can see that it has value for Muratova's work. Back to the main argument. If the micro elements of Muratova's work are, among other things, repetition and doubling, the macro question for me is this: in the name of what? That is to say, to what end does the subject come to self-reflection, to a state of auto-awareness, distinct from the landscape in which the self is located? This is not a Soviet question or a post-Soviet question, or a theological one, or even a human question. We're reminded of these inadequacies by watching Muratova's Horses in Passions, Dogs in Asthenic Syndrome, Cats in Three Stories, Elephants in Sentimental Policemen, and other living beings. It's a question of life, not, for example, communism or theology. By life, I'm not suggesting that for Muratova, her preoccupation with reflexivity calls forth the necessity of political activism or other projects of emancipation, whether they be a matter of psychotherapy, of feminism, or most recently of posthumanism or queer studies. All of these arguments can be brought to bear, as will I myself from time to time, as intriguing lines of analysis. But we know enough of Muratova's work not to invest deeply in any of these worthy arguments. Now, having said that, I want to make a brief note that, of course, Muratova is not without any sense of political engagement. We know her support of the protests of Euromaidan. We know her support of the reclaiming of Ukrainian cinema. So this is not to say this is a woman without political coordinates. It's to say that it's a woman who does not bring that expressly and fiercely to her strategies of filmmaking. If not political activism and its kin, then what is at stake in Muratova's stubbornly resistant films? We find no explicit answer, neither in Muratova's interviews nor in her films, beyond play, creativity, egoism as a descriptive category, not as a judgmental category. Very little is explicit in Muratova. These stakes must be articulated by the viewers themselves. My own answer risks misapprehension, so I'll try it out here. For my own interests in the debates about time, what artistically usually constitutes Soviet, late Soviet, early post-Soviet, post-Soviet, and space, namely what constitutes Soviet, Russian, Ukrainian, etc. Muratova's work is, among other things, central in asking whether these distinctions have any weight whatsoever as bearers of meaning. Perhaps instead they belong to a different measure of time and space that does not lend itself to these social categories. Of course, I understand that as scholars, we must historicize and we must locate. I'm asking a slightly different thing. I invite you to consider more seriously the idea, for example, that the country that we study did not end in 1991. There was a change of name, a change of melody, a change of banners, a change of territorial limits, first a contraction, and then by fits and starts an expansion. But the state that had been constituted on the 29th of December, 1922, and is now approaching its centenary next year in 2022, that state underwent a stressful decade from 1990 to 2000, a tremendously productive period for Muratova, before stabilizing in ways that continue today, stabilizing for better or worse, but stabilizing. Or making the claim to stabilization perhaps is more accurate. So this is its temporal profile, its profile in time. As for space, all territorial names are inadequate. It's no longer the Soviet Union. It's not only the Russian Federation. It's more than the Russian domestic culture. It's not just Eurasia. It's more global than post-Soviet space. When we do cultural analysis, we find ourselves uncertain of catching hold of an adequate word for today's shifting geographical realities. And by this, I mean it's realities in culture. We find in Muratova's frequent demurrals, her frequent refusals, a refusal to sign on to traditional categories, a kind of negative freedom, utterly compatible with this contemporary reality. Let me speak briefly as a self-confessed foreigner. Brought up with a dominant myth of the nation state, with its allegedly firm boundaries and immutable border crossings, Canada, Mexico, we react with unease in the face of Russia's imperial plasticity, its tendency to balloon out and then shrink back as a normal aspect of its legacy of state building since at least the mid-16th century, 1554, the Battle of Kazan in Ivan IV. That nearly 5-century habit of mutable borders, protean, adaptive, one might even say strategically responsive, as we saw in 2014 with Crimea, surely produce in its citizenry an inventory of survival modes, including cinema, that are as varied as they are distinct from the inhabitant of the more insipid nation state, such as the United States, which I acknowledge is also an empire, but I'm speaking of the United States as its robust identity as a nation state. This speculative thought is both keenly relevant and a proper conversation for a different time. So I'm going to put a tochka there and turn the page. I cede to you immediately that my listeners that Muratova does not take up the authority of chronicling any empirical geopolitical reality. She is in no way a filmmaker committed to documenting social events, and her work cannot be freighted with the responsibilities of directly accounting for historical externalities. But this is exactly my point. In her indifference to social documentation, she is therefore a key figure in underscoring the latent continuity across manifest disruption, such as is studied in the departments of sociology, anthropology, political science, economics. From the years of Perestroika onward, precisely the transitional years under discussion here, the director produced 11 full-length feature films, as well as 3 shorts, placing her at the center of the transition for which we have the most inadequate vocabulary, either in its time period or its geographic expanse. My aim is not to reduce Muratova's work to an argument about normal academic periodization, but rather to stage a future discussion beyond this talk about the presence of her work in a much larger field of cultural consciousness that describes Second World modernity beyond our immediate disciplines of film history, film analysis, media studies, however we currently name it. My goal is to resituate Muratova's work beyond the pleiad of art house directors, so as to see it as constitutive of what we might call red modernity. She is not unique. We may choose among the films, not all the films, but among the films of Alexei Balabanov or Alexei German Sr. In each case, the quality of the filmmakers is not their status as auteurs, or even the quality of their work per se, but something closer to a meta-genre. The glimpse their work affords into this civilizational expanse on the screen and elsewhere that perpetually confounds external spatial or temporal coordinates, borders, or periodization, however vital those coordinates normally are in our scholarly work. Our normal taxonomies impede as much as they facilitate, especially in the red landscape that coheres in the 30-year period from roughly 1990 to the present. So that's the second part of the talk. The third part, of approximately the same length, let me check my time, make sure I'm doing okay. Yeah, good. Is called The Red Landscape. In other words, it's an attempt to map out this internal reality system and place Muratova in it, among others. So section 3. 3 additional trends of Second World modernity are relevant to this line of thinking and may be found in specific works by Moscow conceptualists, the satirist Alexander Zinoviev's Homo Sovieticus, and Svetlana Alexevich's Redman, who is, I would argue, a discursive descendant of Zinoviev's hero. As diverse as these 3 examples are, they often take as their focus a central figure utterly without self-consciousness in order to leverage self-consciousness itself. Let's say Prigov's Militsioner, Zinoviev's Gamasos, the Red Man, Muratova's many job figures, particularly from Astenichesky syndrome onward, serve as kind of fulcra to create a sensation of an outside, resonating with Muratova's search for an outside to Soviet consciousness through radical interiority. What we are seeing is the emergence of a metatext. Let me comment telegraphically on each of these choices. Moscow conceptualism found its genesis story in the work of Vitaly Komar and Alexander Milamid in the early 1970s, reaching a peak in Sotheby's auction of Bruskin's work, Fundamental Lexicon, in Moscow on July 7th, 1988. Unlike earlier strategies of Soviet dissidents in the thaw period, the logic of Moscow conceptualism was instead to appropriate the slogans, allegories, and myths of state ideology and to represent them with irony, self-mockery, or outright parody. A narrower category within Moscow conceptualism, most scholars would argue, was sotsart, which was more explicitly concerned with the tropes of Marxism-Leninism, rather than more exclusively the preoccupations of daily life within Second World modernity. But all of these, this cluster is relevant. One needn't take time here to cherry pick among them. A book would cherry pick, but this talk will not do that. If a longer story were told here, it would be the story compatible with elements that we see in Muratova's work: alienation through repetition, automatization, empty performance, performed gesticulation so as to gain traction on everyday lives and gain an advantage over everyday life. Let's turn to Zinoviev equally as briefly. Among the characteristics ascribed to Zinovie's Homo Sovieticus are the following contradictions or oppositions, both of which are simultaneously true because Gamassos himself is incapable of self-analytic cognition, and that contradiction is signaled, the tupest is signaled through that irresolvable contradiction. Gamassos is characterized by passive obedience to the state and passive resistance to the state, by chauvinistic pride, and by mindless admiration of Western products, by indifference to material goods, and by a toleration of petty theft, by a lack of initiative and a keen, almost animal-like sense of self-interest. We see these characters in part, again, a elaborated talk would look for these dramatis personae in Muratova's Chekhovsky motivы, Второстепенные люди, Astenichesky syndrome, and elsewhere. By comparison, if we can move to Alexevich Redman, her Redman is a later figure, born not of the 1970s samizdat, but slightly later in the mid-1980s, and the hope of publication. Narrowly speaking, the Redman belongs to Alexevich's multi-volume cycle, Chronicle of the Big Utopia, or History of the Red Man, 5 of her 6 books, so it has been explained. The figure comes into his own as a discursive trope in the aftermath of 1991, a perceptible haze that's brought in after the crash of the Soviet Union from another time and space, like a man entering the room after a long cigarette smoke, bringing with him a memory of the Soviet closed borders, and not the closed borders of some other entity, such as PRC. I would argue that the Red Man is specifically a Soviet trope. Whether it's Tajik or not is a different argument, but not Chinese. The Red Man is he who has survived, even if survival were accidental or an undesirable fact. And yet the Red Man belongs to a cultural field that's larger than Alexevich's writings and existing on a continuum. It again contributes to the notion of a metatext. As Nelly Bikus points out, quote, this phenomenon of Red Man is certainly not exclusively Russian, Ukrainian, or Belarusian. As a matter of fact, Alexevich demonstrated how various identities formed in the Soviet past and reformed in the present have been combined, reworked, and developed so as to correspond to the logic of a new era, end quote. In this era in which the Russian Federation is expanding in space and in duration and in authority, the durability, some would say the necessity, of the Red Man as a trope with sustained capacity is worthy of our attention beyond Alexevich's work. It belongs to her, and yet it does not belong to her. Indeed, at a time when we now seem to know that Vladimir Putin's period of rule will extend from 2000 until presumably at least 2036, the longest period of rule in the modern era, we find ourselves anew in search of a vocabulary adequate to describe the expansive presence of the red man. Moreover, the current accelerated rapprochements between Belarus and Russia to align the markets, the tax systems, the pensions, the labor laws, and eventually one anticipates the currency, the legislature, and the military structures currently under rehearsal as I speak, as Zapad 2021, lead me to speculate once again on the inadequacy of language, creative, artistic, analytic language to account for the continuity of the red landscape, whose name and borders shift, but whose integrity remains. So we're talking about a kind of imaginary universe that's different from the universe of political science. These differences between Muratova's films and Alexevich's writings, the differences between them are legion. Muratova is an art house film director. Svetlana Alexevich writes documentary novels, quote, collective testimony of a composite character, historic mediation, or in the words of the Nobel Prize Committee, quote, literary nonfiction genre that is entirely her own, end quote. Her mentor, Alice Adamovich, has described this writing as a kind of super literature. And I capture that notion of super literature to make an argument in a moment about a meta genre. What they share is a representation of the Soviet unconscious in the red man, so as to leverage some kind of agency over Soviet reality. Now, I ask myself in this, and surely I'll run into trouble later on if I continue this train of thought in the months ahead, is the term red man an offensive category? My short answer is yes. Each reader will have his or her own answer, even before I finish the sentence. The act of answering, in its spontaneity, its apparent organic and empirical sense of inevitability, is a way of locating oneself in the universe. Rather than argue this or that, I propose we push further into this dark economy of giving offense and taking offense. I have no moral purpose here, no rhetorical inversion that may lead to our redemption and save us from having given offense. Indeed, it is perhaps only in the context of a discussion about precisely Muratova's work that we have the opportunity to move towards offense, recognized as such, without sublation, without God, without salvation, without equivocation or discursive acrobatics, and to keep thinking. As I have understood and written about Muratova's work over the decades, she and many of those, including you who appreciate her work, is least likely to react with effete horror at the etiquette of this conversation. At its effete complexity, yes, but not at its etiquette. The more Muratova dismisses something, the more interesting it becomes. Now, let me check and see how I'm doing for time, because I would like to say something about metatext if I can. Yes, good. Okay, so metatext. Scoot ahead slightly. So I want to take a moment and talk about this category, because anything that begins with the word meta is very irritating, or certainly among those irritating prefixes. I take meta discourse at the simple, or meta genre, meta whatever, let's take meta discourse at the simplest level to mean a discussion on itself, one that raises questions about a topic beyond a straightforward exposition of the answer. At a grammatical level, meta discourse is often introduced as an adverb or as an adverbial clause. For example, finally, certainly, arguably, and other examples. Meta discourse frames an argument with an amplified effort at self-consciousness. You can see why this interests me. Quote, perhaps we can agree, end quote. Quote, more reckless scholars than I would argue, end quote. Beyond the framings of grammar and into the universe of ideas, meta discourse suggests that the weight of scholarship accrued to a topic at a key historical moment is such that it can no longer be possible to capture that weight in a mere footnote or a set of embedded references. Examples might be Orientalism, lieu de mémoire, false consciousness, are no longer reducible to Edward Said or Pierre Nora or Friedrich Engels' 14th of July, 1893 letter to Franz Mehring. It's got to do more work than that. It becomes not only helpful, but mandatory to signal the existence of an entire carabus that has come to surround a given topic. I would argue that such a period of accelerated accrual is happening to our scholarly and our journalistic experience of the cluster that is dominated by the fixed epithet Redman. If I am correct, then my invitation to dialogue with you is in some sense analogous, if considerably more modest and more profane, to the discussions of the Petersburg text. As an example, a constellation of writings identified by Vladimir Toporov, arising, of course, much earlier, but newly redolent even then of a particular style of Soviet introspection from the 1960s to the 1980s. Now, I understand that the Petersburg text has a much longer history, possibly as far back as Pushkin's Bronze Horseman, but this does not interest me here. I don't want that distraction. My concern is that the Soviet instantiation of the Petersburg myth, the sign of Petersburg already situated as in an aftermath in the context of imperial rupture, is what is useful to us here. So the rupture of 1917, like the rupture of 1991, does it matter or does it not matter? In artistic culture, it flickers, I would argue. The Petersburg text is a source of endless richness, in part because it concerns not just Petersburg, but the retrospective glance of Leningraders, Andrei Bitov, Vadim Shefner, the circle of poets around Akhmatova, including Kushner, Rain, Brodsky. The recurrent Leningrad circulation of Petersburg text could be seen as an attempt to cordon off a cognitive field, to increase radical interiority, and to ensure its resistance to contemporary filiations and ideological tugs. Its inventory comprises a variant of what Ivar Neumann has described elsewhere as, quote, stories that a country tells about itself. The Petersburg text and the myths surrounding the written documents serve, among other things, as a kind of real-time experience of the past, a self-aware engagement with nostalgia so as to create distance from the present. The Petersburg myth, emergent anew in the era in which the city had not been St. Petersburg for at least 50 years, was nurtured by this dissociative trope, the indulgence in the wrong name by stitching together of imperial and Soviet traditions, a ritual of continuity in the aftermath of rupture. So that is, in a sense, referring back to the title of the talk today, of dissembling. One dissembles for all kinds of reasons, most of them deeply salvational, if salvation can be a secular topic. This brief discussion does not do the topic justice, but it contains my own emphases and preferences, so I won't elaborate further. My larger point in this section is that such meta-discursive clusters, whether Petersburg text or Petersburg myth or Redman or Homo Sovieticus, constitutes an opportunity for a dialogue about meaning, not about knowledge. As we don't need to hear from the political scientists that X happened and Y happened. Of course that happened, but that is not our trusty comrade as we move into artistic texts with all their contradictions. Let me have a chance to see how I'm doing for time, because I think I want to probably, I probably want to bring this to a halt. So there's an opportunity for utterances uninterrupted from you. Those of you who have been following the recent attacks in cinema on the White Elephant Prize, which is awarded by the Guild of Cinema Scholars and Critics, will realize that we are seeing in real time the disappearance of one of the few highly visible independent awards in contemporary cinema, and one that has been vital in recognition of Kira Muratova's work, which has been honored 4 times by the White Elephant for precisely the same talent, Best Director. How interesting that they would see correctly that she's the best director of an alternative reality system, not, script or something like that. It's not that Best Director is the highest prize. Usually best film is the highest prize, but best director is a tip of the hat to a certain kind of success in building consciousness, independent consciousness. In 2002 for Tchaikovsky Mativy, 2004 for Nastroyщик, 2007 for Dva v одном, and 2013 for Вечное возвращение. The current destruction of the white elephant as an independent prize in cinema, some would say triggered by its recent award to Alexei Navalny's documentary, is exemplary. And it's funny, isn't it, that Navalny, the award to Navalny pierces the skin, the illusion that there's art and there's the world, and brings the whole structure down. The year 1991, once a watershed, is, one could argue, irrelevant in retrospect. Instead, the cultural landscape at this combustible moment, after a brief interruption in 1991, has been one of sustained supervision and monitoring, at least in the cinematic field. My discussion of Kira Muratova has turned out to be more than Kira Muratova, as Yevtushenko would say. A discussion of Muratova sublated to a larger category of cultural meaning. In so widening her cultural framework, I inevitably lose many elements of her work at each stage of its artistic process. What might be gained, if one pursues this line of speculation, is her placement as a key cultural figure in contrast to the larger structure of state consciousness, the persistence of which, if indeed Vladimir Putin will serve as president until 2036, will outlive many of us here today, including me. We owe Kira Muratova many things, but among them is the brilliant and stubborn example of how to think and how to create differently. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you, Nancy, for such a rich talk. I'm sure we will all have a lot of questions, maybe more remarks than questions, because you gave us a lot of things to reflect on. Just to remind you that you can also raise your hand in Zoom and ask a question, or if you are shy, you can also type your question in the chat. So I'm officially opening the discussion. And probably I will start myself. First of all, I liked a lot your idea of maybe I misunderstood, but imaginary empire. This is how I wrote down that. Maybe you didn't even use this term, but somehow that's,
yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Imaginary empire, which is plastic, has this type of plasticity and mutability, which allows also to use this concept both as a political category and as an artistic metatrope. Oh, like a trope is already meta. My question would be, maybe which brings you back to your book, The Imperial Trace. Can you please tell us again, to those who didn't read about your book, to bring this imperial idea of empire and Muratova cinema in some kind of thesis-like form? Thank you.
Briefly, others collect their thoughts. And as I say, I would welcome simply, you have the floor for a couple of minutes and you simply talk, and I will take notes. I welcome your thoughts and I'll attribute them. I might have to circle back around again to figure out who I'm talking to, but I welcome, self-standing utterances, including of alarm and offense. I think the element out of Imperial Trace that most directly flows into this talk is thoughts about what it is like to be born in an empire, not just any empire, because of course the British Empire is quite different from the Russian Empire. And also a footnote, we don't much in the United States, what a surprise, speak of the US Empire as an empire. We the nightly news speaks of us of our own country as a nation state, ideologically as a nation state, and we're inculcated into the notion of a nation state is the norm, that it's everywhere, that Russia is a nation state, and so forth. But flowing over from the idea that if one is educated, born and educated in an empire, moreover, if you're born and educated in a contiguous empire, the stories about the country that we tell ourselves, as Neumann said, they're differently inflected. And how would we tell those stories? How would we find patterns in those stories that are not necessarily reducible to sociological research, data-driven, do focus groups, and out of those focus groups, people mention X so many times and Y so many times, and therefore you can prove things. The assailability of my research, which I would readily acknowledge, is that it tries very hard to do two things. It tries to connect directly with the research of my colleagues who are empiricists, who exist in economics and political science. And I'm the head of a Title VI center. A Title VI center is by definition a center that trains experts. It's meant to train the next generation of experts in this region, in the so-called REACE region or Eurasian region. It's meant to prep those for not just because they have a good heart, but because they want to defend US hegemony. So I do not kid myself. Much of the stuff that I have to do on a daily basis has to do with training language experts, with sending people into governance and so forth. But if I nevertheless, as my daily life, read this stuff, what connections could I make to where my heart lies? To art house cinema, for example, to cultural politics as they're playing out in real time on the internet. What connections can I make? Those connections will be radically untenable. They cannot be proven. They're only speculative, and they can easily be disagreed with. And so what was going on in Imperial Trace was an attempt to kind of leap into that void, in part because the ideas occur to me and I want to write them down, but also because so much of our work is alone. As you know, we write in isolation. We ask ourselves, why are we living this way? My room is a mess. I have no human contact. What's the good of this? And yet it's a form of stitching together macro documents that we read about empirical reality and efforts by filmmakers and artists and playwrights to process that reality in their own way. So that's the bit, it's the empire theory is one element, but also a continuation of this attempt to do something that is, I think, frankly, risky, because it's easy to say it's wrong. And it's easy to create a different argument. I welcome alternative arguments. It's definitely not an empirical argument. It's a highly speculative argument, even though the boiler room of what I do is literally reading about Belarus's tax system and how it does or does not align with the Russian tax system. So it's a bit wacky. I agree. I acknowledge.
Thank you. We have a question from Natasha Drubek.
Natasha, hi.
Hi, hello.
You can see her.
Nancy, I'm so happy to see you.
Yeah, happy to be here.
And we really miss you, I have to, with all our hearts. I don't know how many we have, but I think quite a lot. Dear Nancy, I have two questions. I was impressed by this idea of this, independent conscience existing, maybe still existing, although the author of this conscience is dead, which would mean that it somehow continues existing in the films which we see, and it's still being like, it does not die. It lives in our reception of her films. That's more a remark. But my question today is, there might not be a direct answer, but I think you are the only person who could answer this. Who can today inhabit the alternative Muratova universe in Russia and beyond? Who will continue her, legacy? and this I don't mean only politically, but in every respect, also from a gender point of view.
What a great question. Of course, I can put forth a bunch of names. I'm not sure that it would mean anything, because not only because it's not necessarily true, but because each name that gets spoken requires a justification and all kinds of exceptions and codicils. And so it deteriorates into a kind of, quibbling that needs another time and it needs a glass of wine to talk about properly, I think. So, I mean, clearly among the things that we all are thinking of, if you're thinking ahead of me, and some of you in the room are already thinking ahead of me, I have no doubt, are such people as Miss Janitors among the women directors. And also some of the script writers. There's some great women script writers, particularly in St. Petersburg, that are doing really interesting work. If we restrict the conversation to women for the sake of this moment, I would be hesitant to look for a heroine. I look instead for a network of women who are so brilliant and so much smarter than those of us who sit on the outside and try to do kind of post-Sovietological research. Let them speak for themselves, because they do a better job than we do, and their instincts are sharper and their politics are good, even if what they say on the manifest in print is different from what they would say around the table. And I'm thinking of people like Larisa Malyukova, as different as, let's say, Larisa Malyukova, the cinema critic, Dile Tasbulatova in her own way, who's a complete madwoman, but writes such insightful things that it's impossible not to follow her. And a number of other people who I think as women analysts have their finger on. Oh, and of course, Sitora Alieva, who happens, quote unquote, merely to do Kinotavr Film Festival, but has been such an important spokesperson in pioneering a direction for women artists. I mean, to whom would I listen? I'd listen to Sitora Alieva. I'd listen to Larisa Malyukova, Yelena Stishova. We have, I should tell you, because it's about to come out. I know I shouldn't answer so long, but I want to remember to say, we have coming out, probably in the next week or so, a special issue of the British journal Critical Quarterly. Not Critical Inquiry, but Critical Quarterly. That is a Putin issue. It's called Putin Culture. And it's a series of articles about what constitutes Putin culture. Articles by Viktor Matheson, Malyukova, Tasbulatova, Shpagin, who, his politics are different, but Shpagin is brilliant. Shpagin is a brilliant analyst. Who else? A bunch of other critics that belong to this cluster. So to whom would I look? Of course I would look to artists, but the problem looking to artists is that then your very looking at them makes their head explode. Your very looking at them puts pressure on them to behave in certain ways that they don't want to behave. That was one of the problems with Muratova, She was sick of us wanting her to be X and Y. She wanted to dislike us, and rightly so. Why shouldn't she dislike us? Because it was pressure on her. It took her away from her radical interiority. She didn't want to hear what we thought. She hated that. And, I want to tell her what I think, but I understand that she doesn't want me around. When we would go places and we'd walk together, often she would walk with Lena Stishova. And because Lena Stishova was a friend, I would walk along, we'd walk. But it was very clear to me, Nancy, don't say anything. Don't call attention to yourself. Don't speak. If possible, go away. And so that's why I'm hesitant to name a particular woman filmmaker who might be our North Star, for what that would do to that North Star.
Eugenie Zvonkin.
So Nancy, thank you so much. And
Zhenya, hi, yeah.
Yes, I'm here, all the way in the back. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really very interesting and very, we will need to think about it. A lot of stuff you've said for some time, I think. I just wanted to first comment on one moment in your talk that I was really very, I don't know, happy about. It was about taking and making offense. I think it was so great the way you brought it, and also because I think this is one of the things we kind of struggle in Muratova cinema, is this kind of dealing with cruelty between characters and the cruelty in some ways to the spectator sometimes. And so I think it's a very accurate way to put it. I had two questions, actually. The second one just appeared while listening to your answer. I was wondering if Irina Litvinova, as a director, would appear to you as a hair or not. I would like to comment that. And I think Irina Schulzki maybe would say something also about this, because I think she's actually working on this question precisely. Another question I was having is about this imaginary empire and the position of Muratova in it. I completely agree with what you are saying about her different way of thinking and her being at the same time very in tune with social and political disturbances, but at the same time being completely her own island, one would say. I was quite surprised, and I don't know, by something Evgeny Golubenko told me when he came in Paris for her full retrospective. And we were talking and talking, and at some point he said, I think nobody considered enough that she was a foreigner.
Yes.
She was not from that country. So I was wondering if you would want to comment on that, because she was born and raised not in the Soviet Union. So yeah, well, I would love to hear your comments to these two questions.
So I'll work from back to front. First of all, I probably need your help in recalling the name of the woman filmmaker, documentary filmmaker, who just recently completed the documentary on Muratova. She's a family friend. Her mother was a close friend. You know who I mean.
Yes,
So,
I don't remember her. Yes, but I don't remember her name either.
Okay,
so
it's
sorry.
terrible. It's embarrassing.
I see what film you are talking about.
Yeah, it's a nice thing about getting older is you can blame your bad preparation on age instead of just like laziness. I don't recall her name. It's a great film if you run across it. Absolutely.
What film are you talking about? Because I think I know. What's the title?
It's called something like Kira Softly.
Yes, I know it. Yeah.
You know what I mean. If you get a chance to watch it, watch it. It was nominated for several prizes. It's very interesting. So why am I talking about her? Because a very good passage in that documentary was precisely Zhenya about that issue, that she dressed differently at the Geek. She conducted herself differently. Her body language was different. Her gestures were different. It wasn't that she was more exquisite or she had more cachet or she could get stuff that other people couldn't get, but there was something that was, beyond the border about everything about her. And I think the fact that she was picked out and picked on is not a coincidence. And I think getting picked on, in some weird way was helpful to her. I have this quote that I suddenly am taking off the wall for a moment. Nelson Mandela once said, I am what I am, both as a result of people who respected me and helped me, and those who did not respect me and treated me badly. And you can see the connection yourself. I won't make it, but that ability to metabolize pain, I think, was something that in her own way she did really well. So that's one thing about taking offense. I'm looking at Jane Taubman and Barbara Wurm and Zhenya to some extent also, and thinking, I'd like to give some version of this paper at ASIS in November, because I'm working on it. I'm thinking about it all the time. But you can see in the contemporary environment where we can't say anything without giving offense to people, and rightly so. We can't say X, we can't say Y, that I could well see that in the audience, there would be those who would quite appropriately take offense against some insipid Anglo girl talking about the red man. Why is that not offensive? And I can duck that bullet and blabber on, but I think it's better to say, yeah, it's kind of offensive. It's kind of an offensive term, and explore the reasons for that. And ASIS is doing terrific work in inclusivity, diversity, and so forth. But it will butt heads against issues like this. And probably that's a good thing that it butt heads, regardless of who wins or who loses. So there's that. North Wind. Yeah, North Wind, Litvinova. I would love to read somebody's analysis of that. The reason I was shuffling around, Zhenya, when you were talking was because I have some earlier, my room is a mess. On the floor, on the bed, or under the bed, I have other versions of this paper that have whole sections on Litvinova's North Wind that was in a couple of contests. It didn't get given a contest, an award in this upcoming Golden Arc Festival, sadly. But it's such an interesting film. And of course, it's an homage, explicit homage to Muratova, explicitly on the screen as an intertitle. But then also, of course, you watch it and you cannot help reach for pen and paper to jot down its ornamentalism, its details, its repetition, its and so forth. It has a very strong narrative line. This is the point at which Irina should speak up and say her piece. But I would love to be present at an ASIS panel or something else that looks at that connection of Litvinova and Muratova, but specifically North Wind and Muratova's work. There's a stronger narrative line in Litvinova's more recent stuff. But nevertheless, what an intriguing filmmaker she is. And Muratova took a long time to become Muratova. We didn't realize how valuable she was. For decades, we didn't realize. She kept producing this stuff that irritated us and we fell asleep in. I don't know, I'm sorry I'm talking so much, but there's a very interesting article on soporific, Muratova as a soporific that's absolutely invaluable in its own way. And I hope to get back to it. I was going to footnote it here so I wouldn't lose it. But you can see that Muratova is a soporific, that not therefore being a bad thing, it being a fact of spectatorship is, I think, relevant in ways that Litvinova is not a soporific. It's over the top ornamental. It's, if you get a chance to see it, please do. And Irina, I would welcome your comments on the Litvinova, specifically on North Wind, but in general on that connection.
Yes, thank you so much for bringing up Litvinova, because I just finished the article on Litvinova and Muratova as a genealogy of gesture, exactly based on that paper and ASIS in Philadelphia once 6 years ago. Yes, it should come out soon. And about North Wind, just for those of you who haven't seen the movie, that's the most recent Litvinova's film, which is an homage to Muratova, and apart from all ornamental styles, there is practically Muratova, a quote from Astenic Syndrome, which finishes the film. There is Litvinova dressed up as that woman on the train at the end of Astenic Syndrome, and she's living in the train into nowhere.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's a very impressive. It's one of the most actually striking images of the whole film. And I watched it just recently, by the way, North Wind. I think my interpretation would be about this connection, Muratova and Litvinova. Maybe it's a bit too simple, but let's say in simple terms, it would be that Muratova per se, if we extract Litvinova from her films, would be quite a good example of postmodernism in cinema, but not when Litvinova appears. It's like the other, which really deviates her film style so strongly. There's a very strong authorial line, and I think the result is so amazing, and so it makes the result even more difficult to put in words in some clear categories. And then we also spoke about that, about this ability of this penchant that Muratova had for working in tandems generally. It would be Litvinova or Golubenko. How can we separate those two people? How can we say that it's Muratova's film, especially the last films? Because these are not Muratova's films, these are Golubenko/Muratova's films. Also, the way they appeared in public, they were always like a double figure of Muratova. There was the same relation with Muratova, Litvinova, and maybe some other people before Muratova, Ryazantseva, by the way. Well, she chose Ryazantseva as a representative of herself, because Ryazantseva was giving the interviews, was telling about her past and so on and so on. And there is always a second figure who represents Muratova to the outside, to the outer world, like a medium. You know, so it connects to what you said about her interiority, about her unwillingness to go to outside. Yeah,
like a body double.
Yeah.
There's this term body double that is, when the president of the United States goes anywhere, he always has a body double, or it's sometimes referred to as the body. And it's somebody that steps in at any point. He sits there when photographs are to line up photographs. He apparently his clothes are approximately the same, and he can substitute for the president at any moment. Muratova, in a sense, has body doubles, I think, that help protect her from the outside world.
Yes, and brings me back to Litvinova. In a way, Litvinova it was always a possibility or a way for Muratova to step into her own fictive world as an authorial figure. And also
in a very different way from, let's say, Abdrashitov Mindadze. If you start talking about doubles or pairs, that one, it's a completely different universe, what they represented, not what they claimed to have represented, what their story was. That's one thing, but their how they functioned in the cinematic universe as a double is quite different from Muratova and hers. I'm not sure I could articulate it further than that, but it'd be a very interesting contrast for a scholar that wants to pursue that.
If I may just comment on the Nelson Mandela quote that I love. Yeah. I think you know this wonderful text by Maya Turovskaya about Kira Muratova, where she talks about her vobritism. She invents the word
exactly.
Vobritism, so the contradictism, the fact that she first refutes all your terms and all the ways in which you would ask any question before she answers. Because it was, I think, a defense mechanism towards Soviet system of censorship, that they will all the time tell her that she was wrong in every way. So
no wonder they tried to destroy her. Who wouldn't, and particularly, I don't want to get into a therapy group, but of course for women this is more difficult. You want to please people, you want to get along, you want to advance, you want to deepen, you want to do all the things, and voprikism is not a good strategy for that. And God bless her for nevertheless sticking to that.
During the same period, Larissa Shepitko used all the feminine traits, and her films would not be forbidden, and Muratova's would. So it's a very good counterexample. And about this personal taste and being against all the other tastes, I think Evgeny Golubenko, in one interview, she said, I'm not interested in what the world thinks of my films. If they like it, that's good, but otherwise, well, that doesn't matter. There is only one person who is interesting to me, and it's the person I look at after every end of a shot, and it's Evgeny Golubenko.
Really? Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, you should see this film. I urge you. I'm sorry that I don't have her name or title at hand, but mostly it's Evgeny Golubenko who's narrating. It's almost entirely his account of it. And therefore you get a real insight. Again, he's a kind of a body double for Muratova. It's those of you that do work in.
I also watched it. I really appreciate it a lot. I think she filmed it after her death. Of course, that's why.
Yes.
But it's really gentle film about her.
Now, I don't. Filmed without authorization by Zhenya. So there's a bit of a footage that was made without his knowledge.
That's
she was really not happy about that. But the film is still very interesting, actually.
Yeah, that's right. She wanted to. Yes. Say it again.
Barbara Blum tells Akira Ukratka, Irina Vasileva.
Yes, there. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm embarrassed that I didn't remember it because I really liked her as a filmmaker. I liked the film. The film is invaluable. If I could, get a hold of it as a link, I would keep it and come back to it again and again.
I think it's available online somewhere. Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah, it is.
Probably. I don't know when we need to stop, so I'm happy to.
We still have time. Maybe there is someone from our digital audience. That's the term we invented today. Thank you, Katya. Is somebody from our digital audience who would like to raise their hand and ask a question or a comment?
If there's not, I have another a relevant idea that I want to float.
Yes, please.
I'm quite happy to keep talking. I just don't want to silence anybody. So here's is that okay? Is that all right if I talk for a minute? So here's my thinking. I ask myself, is among the weaknesses of this paper, I catalog for myself, are the following. Number one, is it the same old kind of anti-communist triumphalism that we grew up in? I've been going there and living there for 55 years off and on. And so there are things pickled in my bones that are normal ways of thinking that are not therefore correct. And of course, it's hard when you have friends that are so active against the system and you have loyalties to those friends, not to have one's research turn into a denunciation of the system. And that's not my intent, but I could well see how this paper has those vulnerabilities. So that's number one. Number two, am I saying that all films I like are good films and have to do with alternative consciousness? That's the bit I want to talk about very briefly. I'll try not to run us over time. In my view, and it's an argument that has to be played out more expansively than I can here. Let's take examples of an outstanding filmmaker who is not engaged in this particular game of alternative consciousness. In my view, that's not the game he's playing. If I had to choose that task as an essay assignment in class as a student, I would say, let's look at Zvyagintsev. Some of Zvyagintsev work, like Leviathan, is precisely engaged in that same, battering against the Colossus, quite explicitly, more explicitly than Muratova does, more explicitly than German does, but clearly looking for a place for an alternative consciousness on the cinema screen. Now, we can fine-tune that position, but let's say for the moment that it would appear to be true. In a superficial way, that's a compelling argument. Stick with Zvyagintsev. Would you say that that is also the case about Zvyagintsev Возвращение, the return? Not really. In the returns, Возвращение, Zvyagintsev is much more concerned with the cinematic heritage, with the hoodoo-voodoo of transcendentalism, with abstract thinking, with metaphors, with visual symbols, with the Tarkovsky and Sakurov legacy in cinema. That's really what he's concerned with. He's not battling for an alternative universe. He's conjuring up something else, right? He's conjuring up some other task for which that would be a bad fit. All the more so with his Izgnanie. In Izgnanie, he's not trying to carve out an alternative consciousness that is at odds with Soviet state consciousness. In fact, his changing of all the street signs and in the film, putting up European street signs, putting up European license plates, looking for a building that had a European feel to it, was an attempt to take us out of time and space and have things be difficult to identify, so that it wasn't a kind of Stjob interaction with Soviet reality or Russian reality, post-Soviet reality. It wasn't that, jamming of the system or butting heads or dialogue with, it had to do with a kind of universalism, a deliberately, strategically homogenized or flattened or universalism that he was up to in those two films. Whereas I would say Leviathan is quite different in his orientation. I would say that Yelena, it's much more difficult, even though it had a British background to it, the script. It ended up being an indictment in its own way. And Lyubov is, again, a difficult argument. Where would you place it? So while one must be careful of black and white thinking, this belongs here and this belongs there, it's not the case that good films do what I want films to do and bad films don't, but rather there's a tendency in film in which certain kinds of films are more compatible with this notion of a meta text than other films. And Zvyagintsev is a very, to me at least, a very complicated example. I would keep him out of the argument until late in the argument, precisely because Leviathan is a very different kettle of fish from, let's say, Izgnania. We can choose two like vivid examples in Zvyagintsev's work. Sorry about that binge, but I wanted to, I suppose, expose the vulnerabilities of my thinking, or the edges of it as well.
By the way, do you think that Leviathan stands out in Zvягintsev? For me, it's Yelena that stands out more than Leviathan.
Yeah, Yelena is a quieter film. You know, it takes a long time, or at least when I first watched it, it took a long time for me to realize, oh, this is a retired security guy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, maybe I just didn't live in the Soviet Union long enough, but it didn't occur to me that it was a retired security guy. It occurred to me, oh, and I understand that it's meant to be ambiguous. I thought, oh, well, you know, it's somebody in the nomenclatura who has access to X and Y. And no, it's sharper than that. It's sharper than that. No. And he himself, in interviews, if you recall, Zvягintsev is adamant, in fact, quite rageful about the identification of his film as a kind of socialka. He doesn't want it to see it as a socialka, as a social film, as a social, you know, it's not about that in his view. But of course, that's his own performance in the press conference. He doesn't want to be categorized as a guy that's, you know, doing fisticuffs with the state because he couldn't get funding. As he now cannot get funding, I gather that it's difficult, increasingly difficult for Zvягintsev to get funding for all the reasons we know already. Well, Leviathan didn't do him any favors in that respect.
Yeah. And now back to Muratova. Okay, because Zvягintsev is kind of this Tarkovskian for me.
Yes.
In Muratova, and it brings me back to your Freudian sleep that you said, you were talking about micro elements, yet micro elephants.
Yes.
I found it so terrific.
I made myself laugh.
It's actually a very good way of putting together Muratova's strategy, micro elephants. It's something, because we were talking about a lot about minor gestures, micro strategies of her art, and it's something minor that makes a big thing out of that. Yeah, so it's a great thing.
Yeah, and I think I'm interested in what your thoughts are, but I've often thought one must be careful in ascribing to the animals in Muratova a particular meaning. I think that it's, in some ways, the animals are a mini vacation that she takes. It's a kind of intermezzo, visual and oral intermezzo in the film. I don't think that she's saying that humans are X and animals are Y.
I like very much what you wrote in your book about Muratova's characters as human mammals. Or, yeah, it's exactly this way of thinking them as a kind of in terms of monstrosity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
large repellent mammals.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, no, what I value about her, and I am indebted to Jane for this line of thinking very much, who kind of laid for me a foundation of confidence about thinking these thoughts, is that Muratova allows us as women to be unafraid of thoughts that normally we cover up for men. You know, men say it and we go, oh, well, he didn't really mean that. Sorry, that's awkward. But Muratova doesn't care. You know, she doesn't care. And I'm grateful to her for that reason.
Any questions? In our live audience, there are no questions at the moment. Digital audience.
I think that there's an interesting, let me say one more thing. And if we choose to end early, I don't view it as a failure. I view it as a time of contemplation. I'm very interested in new research, which at the moment, in my knowledge, really exists more in the realm of drafts and talks and conversations rather than published stuff, about Muratova as, in the conference, there was some talk about posthumanism, and the other is queer studies. Now, clearly she won't agree with that, and it doesn't account for everything. But I think that it's the first categories that begins to adequately open up a space for her. And of course, with Litvinova as well, even more so. Litvinova and her partner, who does the music for North Wind. Yeah, yeah.
So we're going to have one more talk on queer perspective in Muratova by Vlad Strukov a bit later.
With Vlad, good. Yeah,
scheduled somewhere in the fall. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
So you're not going to miss it.
Yeah, good. Because one of the things is a question that each of us asks ourselves: am I the right person to be talking about this topic, given my subject position? And of course, with the explosion in diversity and inclusivity and so forth, I'm in the audience. I can join the discussion, or I can ask questions. But I think with queer studies, my PhD students are doing interesting work in that, and I read their work with interest, and there needs to be more of it. But I don't step forward into speaking about it because I just am not sure that that's how my contribution is best characterized.
Okay. Thank you, Nancy, so much for this thought-provoking really talk, and we will go on thinking on what you said, and I hope it will. Not hope. I'm almost sure that it will will appear as a publication. So because we are planning to edit a volume devoted to Muratova. It's going to be probably the first edited volume on her work, at least in English speaking world. Yes, it is going to be in any speaking world. Yeah. Yes, there are individual, indeed. So your call for publication will come true for sure, and I hope we collect all the papers soon after the conference.
I really hope so, because I looked at the papers that were being given, and I really thought, I'm not living my life correctly. Why is it that I'm concerned with whether there's an adequate oral proficiency test for third-year Russian when I could be doing this, And I realize one's paycheck always subdivides into this or that set of tasks, but the more one tries to be a good citizen about all the things one answers for, the more one's internal life is impoverished, and it was impoverished by not hearing enough of the papers given during this event. And it's one more reason why it's really important to write up the stuff that you talked about. It will find a reader, it really will. Some of the stuff here was that in my footnotes were written 10 years ago. But finally, I have a breath where I can actually capture it on the internet, thank God, and put it in as a reminder of things that were important to me. So,
thank you very much. Yes, and the last applause for Nancy.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Be brave. Is there going to